lecture we're going to talk about the foundations of personality. So what are we born with? What leads to our personality? Do we come into the world with a seed of a personality, or is it all shaped by the environment? That's the first question. That's nature versus nurture. So I want you to think about all these things. Which is more important for the following, nature or nurture? Remember, nature would be genetics or inborn traits, and nurture is the environment, such as parenting and nutrition. So take a second to think about each of these and whether you think it's more genetics or the environment. So, which is more important for a person's height? What do you think? Language development? Social skills? The ability to do math? IQ? Do you think any of these are all genetics or all environment? Well, first let's talk about heritability. That's the mathematical estimate of the degree of genetic influence on a specific trait, illness, or behavior. So this ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 meaning more genetic influence. So about 0.5 is considered significant. So remember, the higher the number, the more it relies on genetics. Height. This gets a number of 0.9. That's huge. That's very highly dependent on genetics. Highly dictated by the height of the parents and their genetic lineage. General intelligence. That gets a 0.52. So that's about half and half. Verbal fluency. That's 0.3. So that's low. So that means there's not very much genetic influence on that. Sociability, so how social somebody is, that gets a 0.64. That's high. That's a high genetic influence. Extroversion, 0.51. So again, about half and half. Anxiety, how prone are you to be anxious? 0.7. There's a high genetic influence there. Aggression, that's 0.4. That means it's mostly environment. Belief in God, that's 0.22. That means it is mostly environment, but there is a small genetic component. Hyperactivity, 0.75. That means it's mostly genetic. Did any of those surprise you? So how do we know all this? How do we get those numbers? Well, mostly we do it through twin studies. So you study identical versus fraternal twins, and through adoption studies. They study biological versus adopted children. And by doing this a lot of times, they get these numbers about whether a trait is genetic or environmental. So what are we supposed to learn from all this? Well, nature versus nurture, it's not a competition. We shouldn't even be having this debate anymore. Nature and nurture form a feedback system. Remember when we talked about feedback? They react to each other in positive and negative feedbacks. That means that the environment can encourage a trait or can squash it. So reaction range, the same genotype, that's what's actually in your genetic code, can manifest as a variety of phenotypes. That's how that gene is expressed, depending on environmental factors. So for example, IQ. You're going to have a genotype for what your IQ, quote unquote, should be, but it varies based on the schools and the teachers, the education level of the parents, the number of books read, the amount of nutrition, etc. So what is in your genetic code can vary based on your environment. There's also something that's called niche picking. A person seeks out an environment to fit their heredity. So if you have someone who's naturally good at athletics and sports, they're naturally going to pick out more sports and athletic activities to do, which will make them better at sports and creates a positive feedback loop. So someone who's a better reader will read more books, which makes them in turn a better reader. So this is called niche picking. Most people try to find something that matches their genetic code. If this is something you're interested in, Pink Brain, Blue Brain, one of your books on your list, talks about this a little bit. How girls and boys tend to seek out the environment that matches their tiny brain differences and how that exaggerates those differences. So what is the prevailing thought on nature and nurture? Well, remember, psychology is a developing science, so the prevailing thought changes over time. Currently, human development is considered a dynamic fusion of nature and nurture, neither independent of the other. In other words, we cannot separate the two. Nature and nurture are too intertwined for us to look at them separately. So the advance of technology has changed the field of psychology, and it's changed how we look at these questions, such as through neuroscience or through computers, which led to theories such as the IP theory. So many times there is no right or wrong answer. There can be multiple truths, and what is true might change over time. Now we're going to talk a little bit about neuroscience. So neuroscience, neuron growth, remember neurons grow at an incredibly fast rate through pregnancy up to about 2 years old. The brain is undergoing a huge surge of growth in the neurons. Something else that happens is called pruning. Synapses and connections that aren't used get pruned away. They wither and die. So, for example, language development. Babies are born with the ability to hear the sounds in all languages, but the sounds that they don't hear as part of their native language get pruned away. They lose the ability to hear those sounds. So neuron growth and pruning work together to improve and develop the brain. The peak growth period is between the ages of 1 and 6. These are when synapses, which are the connections between neurons, are growing the most. Brain scans reflect early childhood development. We can see the effect of the environment by using brain scans. So let's look at some. Both of these are brains of a 3-year-old child. This is a normal brain. This is one of extreme neglect. So as you can see, the environment or nurture can drastically change the brain, physically change the brain. Here's another brain scan. This is a healthy brain. All this red and green and yellow, that's high activity. If you look over here into an abused brain, you see there's much less activity. And what they highlighted here is the big difference in the temporal lobes. You can see the difference between these two brains. Well, why do we care about the temporal lobes? Well, over here it says the temporal lobes regulate emotions and receive input from the senses. So children who are abused and have less activity in their temporal lobes often suffer from emotional and cognitive problems. Okay, so the way a child is raised and nurtured can physically change their brain. And neuroscience has shown this in a way that early psychologists were not able to understand. We talked a little bit about brain plasticity before. Remember when we mentioned sensitive periods? The brain has an amazing ability to rewire itself, but if a critical period is missed, this skill can never develop. However, if a sensitive period is missed, that skill may still be developed, but it'll be much harder and can take longer. As the brain ages, rewiring becomes harder. The brain stops developing at around the age 25. Rewiring is still possible after this, but it's much harder. So I'm going to take you through a brief sequence of brain development. So this is a rough sequence. It obviously doesn't fully complete one part of the brain before moving on to the next, but it can give you an idea of the sequence of how the brain works. First, we get the autonomic functions. These are in the brain stem. They're the lower part of your brain, near the top of your spine. This is what controls breathing, heart rate, temperature control. You can understand why this has to develop first. Next is the limbic system. This processes sensory information and has memory storage. Okay, so that develops second. After that, you see development in the occipital and temporal lobes. These the parts of the brain that control vision and hearing. So again, you're focusing on senses. So it's like first you learn how to breathe and have a heartbeat, and then the brain focuses on systems. And most of these develop prenatally. And then we see more development in the temporal lobes, but this time the part of the temporal lobes that controls speech and language production. So that's why children don't start speaking until they're 1 or 2 years old, because their temporal lobes haven't developed to that point yet. Last to develop is the frontal lobes. These are responsible for planning and abstract reasoning, emotional control. We will talk about this a lot in this class. The prefrontal cortex contains all our higher functions, and it is the last to develop. It doesn't fully develop until you are 25. So a good book on this topic, if you're interested in neuroscience, is The Whole Brain Child. It really breaks down the neuroscience of child development and how their brains grow and how we can foster that growth. All right, we will talk about temperament in the next video.